This video is going to focus on the QC Pro gauge management software product. And just before we begin, there are probably a few things to discuss related in general terms related to this program. I mean, the primary purpose of this program is for scheduling calibrations and for maintaining historical records of gauge activities, and that's what we're going to focus on today or in this video. The other aspect of the software relates to measurement systems analysis, or MSA for short, things like gauge repeatability and reproducibility, bias, linearity, all of those statistical analyses of gauge error. And that will be discussed in another video that you can have a look at separate to this one. So let's begin by perhaps setting up a gauge from scratch. We'll click on File, and from the drop-down list we'll click on Gauge. And this brings up the gauge detail window, and it's in edit mode right now, and there's one gauge already in here which has been already set up. So we'll set up a brand new gauge, and to do that you click on the toolbar button at the top here with the title New. That clears out the entire screen for us to enter a new gauge ID, description, and so on. So we'll start with the gauge ID. So we'll just set up something like BGP-011693 as an example. And then the description of this gauge, let's say it's a vernier caliper. And these are all optional, by the way. These description, location fields are optional, but we'll enter them anyhow. And in the location we'll put in QC. Available for use, well, if the gauge was sent out for repair or something like that, then you would uncheck this box and you would get a drop-down list of various reasons that the gauge is not available, but we'll just leave the check there for now. And that's pretty much how we set up a gauge. We could just leave it at that, or we'll continue just by talking briefly about this area here. When you're first setting up a gauge from scratch, you need to give it a starting point so that it can add the calibration interval to that starting point and tell you when that gauge is going to be due. Once you start calibrating gauges and recording the calibrations within the software, then it'll use the last calibration date and add the calibration interval. So, let's say first of all, let's say the interval is not days, but let's say it's months. So we'll change that unit to months, and let's say we want to calibrate this gauge, I don't know, let's say every 4 months. So we'll type in 4 in there. And here we've got the startup date set to the current system date, which happens to be July 6th, 2016. But let's say we want this gauge to be calibrated 4 months from, let's say, a startup of June 15. So we'll change that to June for the month, and we'll change the day to 15, and now it will add 4 months to June 15 and give us a calibration due date for that particular gauge. Now if you happen to calibrate that gauge prior to that date, then whatever date you do calibrate that gauge on, it'll add 4 months to that particular date, and that'll be your next calibration due date. So if we click on the Save button just to save everything that we've done so far, which is this toolbar button in the top left, this goes into the database as is, and that's pretty much it in terms of setting up a gauge. Now we'll just quickly add a few more things here just so that we can see some of the other features of the software. Now there are some custom fields that you can set up that are user-defined. These are all user-defined fields, which are done either directly here or elsewhere in the software. If it's going to be global for all gauges, it's done elsewhere in the software. So this happens to be a global set of fields that can be used later on, for example, to filter on for reports. You might want to say, give me a list of all gauges where the manufacturer has mid-toil, for example. So we'll just fill this in. So for the manufacturer, let's say it's a mid-toil manufacturer, and let's say the graduation on this gauge is 1/1000th of an inch, and the size of this gauge, vernier caliper, let's say it's a 0 to 6-inch vernier caliper. So we now have these fields set up, and we'll go ahead and click on Save again. The other thing that you can do, you'll notice there's some tabs here. So we've just entered information related to these custom fields. You can assign a picture to this gauge if you wish. Again, this is all optional. So let's say we want to put a picture or assign a picture for this gauge. So we're going to browse to where that picture file might be. It's you know, any modern graphic file like BMP or GIF or JPEG or PNG, I think it is, yeah, PNG. All of those files are acceptable, and many more as well. So I happen to have a picture of a caliper in here in this folder called Gauge Files, and I'm just going to call up that particular one, and then I'll click on the Apply button. So now this picture will also be associated with this gauge. And then the next tab is Procedures. Those procedures that are used to calibrate the gauge can either get typed in here and stored with the gauge, or they can be set up as a global type of procedure, like if you have, for example, 15 vernier calipers that are all 0 to 6 inches, rather than typing it in separately for each gauge, you can set up what's called a global procedure for this vernier caliper. And that's what we'll do here. So we'll click on the list button for the global procedures. We've already preset one of them. You can have as many procedures as you wish, but you would go through this list, and then you would be able to associate this particular procedure with this gauge. And then we'll click on the Apply button so that it's now tied into this gauge. The other thing that we can set up at this point with the gauge would be where you want to check the gauge. So for example, let's say we're interested in checking the gauge at several positions along the operating range of that gauge. So it's a vernier caliper, and so we would probably want to check it, you know, midway or thereabouts. So let's say we check it at 0 to 6 inch caliper. Let's say we check it at the 2-inch position, and let's say the tolerance at that point is 1/1000th of an inch on the plus side, and also 1/1000th of an inch on the minus side. And let's say we also want to check the vernier caliper at the 4-inch position. And again, let's say the tolerance remains 1/1000th of an inch, plus or minus. Oops. Okay. And you can further identify what you're going to use to calibrate the gauge. You might want to use a gauge block or something like that. So, for example, let's say the gauge, we're using a gauge block. So let's say this is called gauge block. Oops. Gauge block -1, and this is gauge block -2. Okay, so now we'll just click on the Apply button, so that gets saved with the database. And you can add as many standards as you wish. For example, if you wanted to check it at the 5-inch position, you would type that in as well. But we'll leave it at that for now. And that pretty much is the entire process of setting up a gauge with all these elements of picture, procedures, standards, and we won't talk about stability or parts right now, but that's pretty much it for setting up a gauge. Now, once you've set up a gauge, then the next step would be perhaps to determine when this gauge is due. So we can see in this particular case that if you add 4 months to June 15, it happens to come out to October 17. When you take months that have 30 days and 31 days and all that kind of stuff, it comes out to that particular day that it's due. So we can see if this gauge is due by going just quickly over to Reports, click on Report, click on Report Options, and I'm going to try and figure out, or narrow down actually, not figure out, but narrow down, to try and get a list of gauges that are due, let's say in the month of October. So if we click over here and we enter from beginning of October until the end of October, for example. And so this is our range that we're interested in for our report. So we're basically filtering to see a report that's of interest to us. So we're interested in a list of gauges that are due in the month of October. And we click on OK, and that kind of goes back to the database and retrieves any gauges that are due. And then we click on Report again, and we go to the Gauge Due Report. You'll see that, first of all, our date range is here. This is what we filtered on. And the only gauge that's due is the gauge that we just set up, and it's due on October 17 as expected. So this is how you would actually, we'll come back to this in a few minutes, but this is how you would identify the gauges that you're interested in. So for example, if you're interested in what gauges are due next week, you would put in next week's begin date and end date, for example, and it would give you a list of gauges that are due in that period of time. So that's just a quick sidetrack into the Gauge Due Report. Now, what I'd like to do is show you how we enter a gauge activity. So for example, let's say we didn't wait until October 17. Let's say we actually calibrated the gauge more recently. To do that, we would go to File, Transaction, and it pulls up a window called Transactions, which has our particular gauge shown here. In the middle of the screen, we've got transaction history, which happens to be empty because we haven't done anything so far, and the due date. Now, let's say we want to record an activity like a calibration, so we'll click on this new toolbar button again, and it brings up a window called Transaction Detail with the current system date, which happens to be July 6th. So let's say we actually calibrated this gauge today, for example, July 6th. If we leave that date there, and then let's say we put in, who calibrated the gauge. So, for example, let's say it was Bill who calibrated the gauge, and so we'll type in Bill for the done by. And the type of transaction is a calibration, so we'll stick to that. We'll talk about MSA, as I said, in another video. And let's say in this particular case, everything was acceptable. Let's say we're going to tie into this. As an option, you have the ability to tie in an external document, like for example, a certificate of calibration. If you had it sent out to be calibrated, you can tie that in to this particular transaction activity. So in this case, we're going to do that. So we'll say acceptable. See linked in calibration certificate. And now we'll also, before we actually link in that calibration certificate, we'll just put in a few more things. For example, the master reference, let's say there's some NIST standard like 243, just as an example. And the calibration gauge used, let's say it was just a gauge block. Okay, so that takes care of some of that stuff. And now the targets, we had set up a 2-inch position and a 4-inch position to check the gauge. So now let's have a look, and let's say we checked the gauge and it was 1.998 before it was calibrated using the gauge block, 2-inch gauge block. And so that is flagged in red because it's out of spec. 1.999 would be our maximum spec value for the tolerance. And let's say afterwards we were able to get it back to 2.000. So we're happy there. And then for the 4-inch position, we'll type in before. Let's say it was exactly at 4 inches. And of course after we didn't have to adjust it, so it remains at 4. And so now if we click on the link button here, we can browse to an external document, and I'm going to go to a folder on here that I created ahead of time called Gage Files. And there happens to be a calibration certificate in there, so we're going to click on that and attach that to this particular record. So this particular transaction record now has this calibration certificate tied to it. It's a PDF document, so if you ever want to see that document, as long as you have an Adobe Reader in your system, you'll be able to see the PDF file. We'll click on the Apply button to save everything. And that takes us back to the transaction window, and now we can see in the transaction history that we've done one calibration today and who did it and so on. And we'll build up a history of transactions as we add more and more transactions. So if we look over here, this particular calibration was done on July 6th. So 4 months from July 6th takes us into November the 7th of November 2016. That's the next due date. While we're on this screen, although you don't have to do it on the screen, there are calibration labels that you can generate if you wish. Again, this would be an option if you wish to use it. And you can either go to sort of a dedicated label printer, laminated label printer, like Brother type of printer, or it could go to one of your run-of-the-mill laser printers or inkjet printers that take 8.5 by 11 paper with multiple labels on it. You would have to preset in the software, in this software, what kind of label you're trying to generate, and we've done that ahead. So we'll click on the calibration label button, and that gives us the label for this particular gauge, just to make it a little bigger so we can see. Now, this label we've set it up prior to this little video to print in a landscape mode on a kind of laminated printer label. So what will come out will be something like this, and all these fields that you see here are actually set up ahead of time by the user. So you don't have to show description, or you don't have to show the due date, but these are kind of the things that people like to see. So that's what we are showing here. And so that is the label, and then you would just press the print button up here, and out would come the label on your printer. All right, at this point, I'd like to focus a little bit on the reporting segment of the software. And to do that, we click up here on the menu item called Report. And the first thing we can look at is called Report Options. Report Options allows us to manipulate what we want to report on. For example, if we were interested in, I don't know, let's say all calipers, vernier calipers, and nothing else, we would actually, in this field called Description, in the From and the To columns, we would type in vernier caliper. And that would allow us to get a list of gauges, for example, that are just vernier calipers. You can also sort lists. For example, the gauge list report can be sorted in various ways. The default is by gauge ID, but any of these can also be selected to get the order in which you want to see the list. And then the range, we did this earlier. We actually selected a date range that we were interested in. This is probably the most common use of this part of the software, is to identify the date range that you're interested in seeing. So for example, if you want to see what gauges are due in the month of November, you would click on this option button for enter date range, and then you would type in from, let's say, November 1st to 2016, for example, till November 30th, 2016, and that would give you all your reports filtered by a date range. In addition to that, you have a tab here called which identifies what kind of gauges you want to report on. In this case, we're going to report on only those gauges that are available for use. That's sort of the default. But if you were interested in, getting some reports that were based on those gauges that are not available for use for whatever reason, they're out for repair or they're broken, whatever, then you would click on this option button. So we're going to actually stick to this one. And we never really talked about this, but you can sort of associate various manufactured parts to a particular gauge. And if you were interested in getting a list of gauges for a particular part number that you're manufacturing, that's what this would come into. So we're not actually going to set any of these report options. We're just going to kind of leave it alone and let it stay in its natural state. And we'll just get out of here, and we'll look at some of the reports that might be of interest. So again, if we click on report and we go down to the gauge list report, this gives us a list of all the gauges that are in our system. We haven't filtered on anything, so it's basically every gauge that's in here. And we don't have that many actually, but for demonstration purposes, these are the gauges that are in our system and the various pieces of information that might be of interest. So for example, for our gauge that we had set up together, we see that in our list, and the next calibration due date is shown here, and its calibration interval is also shown, along with all the other different gauges that are in here as well. This report, along with all the other reports, can be printed by clicking on here, or if you wish, you can export it to an external file. Like for example, if you want to send it to a Word document, you would click on here and identify where you want to put the Word document and what you want to call the Word document, and then it would save it as a Word document, for example. You can also email this report if you wish, and there's that ability. You just have to connect your email system into our software so that it functions properly. But for the most part, I think people generally like to print off this thing, or if not print it, at least save it as an external file to a Word document, and if they wish, they can attach it to email and send it on their own. So that's the gauge list report. And then the other reports that might be of interest, we already talked about this before, but let's have a look at this one, the gauge due report. So for example, the date that is current in our system right now is August 29, 2016, and this report is just a reflection of what is due up to and including today's date. So these are the gauges that are due. There are 3 gauges that are due. Each of them have a particular date, and they're all due up to and including today. Basically, they're overdue. The one that we had created in this video is only due in November, so it's kind of not showing up on this report at this time. And then the other report that might be of interest is something called a Gage History. So the Gage History would be for the various gauges that are currently being looked at, what has been done over time, up to and including the date, in this case, of August 29, 2016, or whatever you filter on, had you gone into report options and filtered. So as an example, here we have one gauge that we had set up together, and it shows what has been done up to and including today, and we know there was only one calibration done on this date, and the before and the after readings are shown, and whatever else we recorded in that calibration record or transaction, as we call it, are shown here as well. In addition to these kind of reports, we also can generate what's called I guess a calibration work order. So that would be something like this, where you would generate an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, if you wish, and print it out and give it to the person who's going to calibrate the gauge. So for example, this particular gauge has I guess all these different elements associated with it. It's a micrometer, and the size of the micrometer is 0 to 1 inch, and you can sort of record manually on a piece of paper the information that you see here, and then take that piece of paper and then go back in and enter it into the system at a later time. So this is kind of optional. You don't actually have to print this out, but it might be of some use to some companies. And I believe that more or less covers everything that I wanted to sort of talk about in a sort of a big overview kind of way. There are a number of little things that I didn't talk about, and for that I'll recommend you have a look at the user guide to guide you, and that way you can get more details. But that's pretty much it for this session, and I'll let it go at that. So thank you very much for watching.